At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter stood up, tapped her wine glass for silence, and looked me straight in the eyes. She did not say thank you. She did not say she loved me. Instead, she looked at the rest of the table and then back at me with a cold, rehearsed smile. She said, "Dad, we had a meeting. We had a vote. And the result is that you are not part of this family anymore. You are officially out." I sat there with a fork full of stuffing halfway to my mouth. I looked at my son, Tyler. He looked at his plate. I looked at my sister-in-law, Linda. She just took a long sip of her wine and nodded. Then my daughter, Madison, reached into her expensive leather bag and pulled out a legal document. She slid it across the table right next to the gravy boat. She told me I had 1 week to pack my things and move into a nursing home she had already picked out. She said the house and the farm were being signed over to her today. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just looked at the 3 people I had spent my entire life protecting. I looked at the hands that had worked 14 hours a day in a greasy machine shop to pay for their college and their fancy cars. Then I reached into my own pocket. I pulled out a yellow folder I had been carrying all day. I placed it on the table and said, "Well, since we are doing business on Thanksgiving, I think you should read this before you start celebrating." The second Madison opened that folder. The color drained from her face. She started shaking. She started screaming. But before I tell you what was inside that folder and how I turned the tables on my own flesh and blood, I need to ask you for a small favor. My name is Arthur Sterling, but my friends call me Artie. I am 72 years old, and I am sharing my story because I know I am not the only one who has been treated like a rug by the people they love. Please take a second to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. It helps an old man like me feel a little less alone in this world. Now let me tell you how this nightmare really began. The morning of Thanksgiving started out like any other. It was a cold, gray morning in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The wind was howling through the old oak trees, and the first flakes of snow were starting to stick to the porch of the farmhouse I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I woke up at 5 in the morning just like I have every day of my life. My joints were aching from the damp cold, especially my left knee that I blew out back in the 80s working on a tractor engine. But I did not mind the pain. I was excited. My kids were coming home. My wife Catherine passed away 5 years ago from a long battle with cancer. Ever since she left, this house has felt too big and too quiet. I spent all week getting ready. I went to the local butcher and got a 25-pound turkey. I spent all Wednesday peeling potatoes and making the cranberry sauce from scratch just the way Catherine used to do it. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted my kids to feel the warmth of a real home again. By noon, the house smelled like sage cinnamon and roasting meat. I had a fire going in the hearth, and I was wearing my best flannel shirt. I even put out the good china that we only use for special occasions. Madison arrived first. She drove up in a brand new white Mercedes that probably cost more than I made in 3 years at the shop. She did not hug me when she walked in. She just handed me her coat and complained about the traffic on the turnpike. She spent the first hour on her phone pacing back and forth in the living room, talking about real estate deals in the city. She looked at the old wooden floors and the stone fireplace like they were trash. Then Tyler showed up. He is my youngest, and he has always been a bit lost. He looked tired. He did not look me in the eye when he said hello. Linda, my late wife's sister, arrived last. She has always been a bitter woman, but I kept inviting her because Catherine loved her. We sat down at the table at exactly 4 o'clock. The air in the room was heavy. Usually Thanksgiving is a time for laughing and telling stories about the old days. But today, it felt like a funeral. Madison kept checking her watch. Tyler was fidgeting with his napkin. I tried to start a conversation about the farm. I told them that the roof on the barn finally needed replacing and that I was thinking of selling a few acres of the backwoods to cover the cost. That is when the mood changed. Madison stopped eating. She looked at Tyler, then at Linda. They shared a look that made my blood run cold. It was a look of agreement, a look of people who had already made a decision behind my back. Madison cleared her throat and stood up. She is a beautiful woman, but at that moment she looked like a stranger. She looked like a shark. She started talking about how the world is changing. She used big words like cognitive decline and asset management and family legacy. She said that I was getting too old to live alone. She said that the farm was too much for me to handle. I told her I was doing just fine. I told her I still did my own oil changes and mowed my own 5 acres. But she did not listen. She spoke over me like I was a child. She said they had a Zoom meeting last Sunday. Just the 3 of them. They had discussed my future. And they had decided that I was no longer fit to be the head of the family. They had voted to remove me from all family decisions. I looked at Tyler. Tyler, I said, do you really feel this way? I paid off your student loans last year. I gave you the down payment for your condo. You really think I am some old man who needs to be locked away? Tyler could not even look at me. He just mumbled something about how Madison knows best and that he was worried about the property value. Then Linda chimed in. She told me that Catherine would have wanted it this way. That was the lowest blow of all, using my dead wife's name to steal my home. Linda said that the farm should be sold so everyone could get their share now while the market was high. She said I was being selfish by staying here. I sat there in silence for a long time. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I could hear the wind rattling the window panes. I looked at the turkey I had spent 10 hours cooking. It looked like a dead thing on the table now. I realized then that they did not see me as a father or a brother. They saw me as an obstacle. I was just a pile of money and dirt that was standing in the way of their new cars and their city lives. Madison pushed a pen toward me. She said, "Just sign the papers, Dad. It is for the best. We already found a place for you in Jersey. It has a nice garden. You will like it there." I looked at the pen. Then I looked at her. I realized that if I signed those papers, I would die in that nursing home within a year. I would die of a broken heart. They were not trying to help me. They were trying to erase me. But what they did not know was that I am a mechanical engineer. I spent 40 years looking at how systems work. I know how to spot a leak before the pipe bursts. And I had spotted their leak months ago. I had noticed how Madison was asking too many questions about my bank accounts. I had seen the mail that was not supposed to come to this house. I reached down and picked up the yellow folder that I had hidden under my chair. I did not sign her paper. Instead, I laid my folder on the table. I looked at Madison and said, "You know, I always taught you that you should never start a fight unless you know exactly who you are fighting. You think I am just an old man who stares at the birds, but I am still the man who built this life from nothing, and I am not going anywhere." Madison laughed. She thought I was bluffing. She picked up the folder and flipped it open. She thought she was going to see a drawing or an old photo, but she did not. Her eyes went wide. She stopped breathing for a second. The first page was a copy of a bank statement from the family trust. A statement that showed she had been stealing thousands of dollars every month for the last 2 years to pay off her gambling debts. The second page was an eviction notice. Not for me, for her. Because it turns out the Mercedes she was driving and the apartment she lived in were still legally in my name. And I was taking them back. Right now. I sat there in the silence of my own dining room, a room I had painted myself just 3 summers ago. The smell of the turkey was still heavy in the air, but it did not smell like a celebration anymore. It smelled like rot. I looked down at my hands resting on the white tablecloth. They were not pretty hands. My knuckles were swollen with arthritis, and there were deep permanent grease stains under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. My palms were thick with yellow calluses, and I had a jagged white scar running across my thumb from the time a lathe snapped back in '94. These hands were my life story. They were the tools I had used to build a world for my children, and now those same children were looking at me like I was a broken piece of equipment that needed to be hauled off to the junkyard. I looked at Madison first. She sat there in her silk blouse, her hair perfectly styled, looking like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. I remembered the year she turned 16. She had her heart set on a private academy in the city, a place for gifted students that cost more than I made in 6 months. Her mother, Catherine, had worried we could not afford it, but I told her we would find a way. I took a second job at a tool and die shop across town. For 4 years, I worked 14 hours a day. I would leave the house before the sun came up and crawl into bed long after everyone else was asleep. I remember coming home so tired that I would fall asleep at the kitchen table with my boots still on my face, covered in metal shavings and oil. I did it because I wanted her to have a life where she did not have to get her hands dirty. I wanted her to have the best, and she got it. I paid every cent of her tuition, her books, and her first apartment in Manhattan. Now she was using that education to try and trick me into a cage. She looked at me not with love, but with a cold, calculated pity. It was the look a landlord gives to a tenant who is behind on the rent. Then I turned my eyes to Tyler. This was the boy I used to carry on my shoulders through the apple orchards behind this very house. When he was little, he would follow me into the garage and sit on a stool for hours, watching me fix engines. He would ask 1,000 questions, and I would answer every single one of them. I called him my little shadow. When he got older and started making mistakes, I was always there to catch him. When he crashed his car, I stayed up all night fixing it so he would not lose his job. When he got into debt with people he should not have been talking to, I dipped into my retirement savings to clear his name. I did it because he was my son and I believed in him. But now my little shadow would not even look me in the eye. He kept his head down, staring at a piece of corn on his plate like it was the most interesting thing in the world. When Madison said the words about me leaving, Tyler did not say a word in my defense. He just gave a small, weak nod. That nod felt like a lead pipe hitting me right in the chest. It was the sound of a son giving up on his father because it was easier than standing up for what was right. And then there was Linda, my sister-in-law. My wife Catherine had loved Linda like a twin. When Linda's husband passed away 10 years ago, she was left with nothing but a mountain of hospital bills and a mortgage she could not pay. I told her not to worry. I told her that as long as I was breathing, she would have a roof over her head. I paid her bills for 3 years. I fixed her roof when it leaked, and I cleared her driveway every time it snowed. I treated her like a sister. I thought we were a team holding on to the memory of Catherine together. But as I looked at her now, she was holding her wine glass with a smug little smile. She was already looking around the room, probably deciding which of my furniture she was going to take for herself once I was gone. She was not a sister. She was a vulture waiting for the old lion to grow weak enough to be picked apart. The pain I felt in that moment was not like a sharp cut. It was a heavy, dull ache that started in my stomach and moved up to my throat. It was the realization that I had spent 40 years building a foundation of love and sacrifice, only to find out I had built it on sand. I had thought that by giving them everything they would learn the value of family and loyalty. But I had been wrong. By giving them everything, I had only taught them how to be hungry for more. They did not see the man who had sat by their beds when they were sick. They did not see the man who had worked through the pain of a broken back to make sure they had Christmas presents. All they saw was an old man sitting on a pile of valuable land and a bank account they wanted to control. I felt a tear sting the corner of my eye, but I did not let it fall. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I took a deep breath, and I could feel the cold, hard strength of the machine shop rising up inside me. I had survived winters in unheated garages. I had survived the loss of my wife. I had survived recessions and broken bones. I was not just an old man. I was Arthur Sterling, and I had built things that were meant to last. If they wanted a war, they had picked the wrong man to fight. I looked at the three of them, and for the first time in my life, I did not see my family. I saw three strangers who had made a very big mistake. Madison cleared her throat, her voice sharp and impatient. "Dad," she said, "don't make this difficult. We are doing this because we care about you. We want you to be safe. Just sign the papers so we can move forward." I looked at the papers, and then I looked at her. My voice was low, but it was steady. It was the voice I used when I was telling a young apprentice how to handle a dangerous piece of equipment. "You say you care about me, Madison," I asked. "You say you want me to be safe." "Of course," she said, blinking her eyes like she was trying to look sincere. I leaned forward, the wood of the table pressing against my chest. "Then tell me," I said, looking at each of them in turn, "if I sign these papers, and I give you this house and every penny I have left, and then I get sick tomorrow, which one of you is going to come sit by my bed? Which one of you is going to hold my hand when I am scared?" The room went completely silent. Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Linda suddenly found something very interesting to look at out the window. Madison opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She did not have an answer because she had never even thought about it. To her, I was already gone. I was just a legal problem to be solved. I nodded slowly. "That is what I thought," I said. "You don't want a father. You want an inheritance. Well, I have spent my whole life making sure you got what you deserved. And tonight is no different. You're going to get exactly what you deserve." I reached for the yellow folder. The weight of it felt good in my hand. It was the weight of the truth. I knew that once I opened this folder, there would be no going back. The family I thought I had would be gone forever. But as I looked at their greedy, expectant faces, I realized that family was already dead. It had died the moment they decided to vote me out of my own life. It was time to show them that while an old engine might be rusty on the outside, it can still pack enough power to blow the whole system apart. Madison slid the paper across the table. It landed right on top of my plate, covering the turkey and the gravy I had spent all day preparing. I looked down at the document. At the top in big cold letters it said, "Family Trust Asset Transfer and Quitclaim Deed." It was a fancy way of saying that I was giving up everything. My house, my 5 acres of land, my workshop, and every piece of equipment I owned. Everything Catherine and I had worked for since 1975 was sitting on a single piece of paper, waiting for my signature. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind rattling the window panes in the kitchen. Tyler was still looking at his lap, picking at a loose thread on his pants. Linda was leaning forward, her eyes locked on that gold pen Madison had placed on the table. They looked like people waiting for a lottery drawing. They were not worried about where I would sleep next week. They were just calculating how much they would get once the land was sold to the developers who had been sniffing around the county. Madison leaned in. Her voice was soft, like she was talking to someone who had lost their mind. "Dad," she said, "this is the only way to keep the estate safe. If you get sick and the state takes over, we lose everything. We voted to put me in charge because I understand how these things work. Lawyer on standby to notarize this tonight. It is for the legacy of the Sterling name. I looked at her. I looked at the daughter I had taught to ride a bike on the very dirt she was trying to steal. The legacy? I asked. My voice sounded like gravel under a boot. You think the legacy is the money in the bank? The legacy is the blood in your veins and the way you treat people. This house is where your mother took her last breath. This workshop is where I taught Tyler how to weld. And you want to turn it into a trust fund for your shopping trips in the city? Madison's face hardened. Her fake kindness disappeared faster than a shadow when the lights go on. Fine, she snapped. If you want to be difficult, we can do this the hard way. We have the vote. 2 children and your only living relative. We can go to court and have you declared incompetent. Do you really want to spend your last years in a courtroom, Dad? Just sign the paper and let's be done with it. I didn't flinch. I didn't get angry. I just felt a strange kind of peace. It was the same feeling I used to get when I finally found the one broken tooth in a massive gear system. Once you find the break, you know exactly what you have to do to fix it. I realized then that they had already spent the money in their heads. They had chosen a stack of green paper over the man who had given them life. It is funny, I said, leaning back in my chair. I had a feeling this Thanksgiving was going to be different. I could feel the rot in the air the second you walked through that door. You talk about votes, and you talk about gifts. Well, it is a strange coincidence, Madison, because I have a gift for you too. I reached down beside my chair and picked up the yellow folder. It was an old folder, the kind we used at the shop to hold blueprints and invoices. It was stained with a little bit of oil from my workbench, and the edges were frayed. I placed it on the table right next to her legal contract. The yellow of the folder looked bright and aggressive against the white tablecloth. What is this? Madison asked, her lip curling in a sneer. Is this your old scouting records or maybe some drawings you want us to look at? We don't have time for a trip down memory lane, Dad. I smiled then. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had survived 40 years of high-pressure steam and heavy machinery. No, Madison, I said. This isn't a memory. This is the truth. Since you were so busy having secret meetings on Zoom, I decided to do a little research of my own. I might be old and I might be slow, but I still know how to read a balance sheet. And I still have friends in this town who remember when you were just a little girl in pigtails. Tyler finally looked up. His face was pale. Dad, what are you talking about? I ignored him and looked straight at Madison. Open it, I said. Since you are so interested in the Sterling legacy, I think you should see what you've contributed to it lately. Madison sighed, rolling her eyes at Linda. She reached out and flipped the folder open. She was expecting to see some old photos, or maybe a rambling letter about how much I loved them. She was ready to laugh. She was ready to tell me I was being sentimental and weak. But as she turned the first page, her face didn't stay smug for long. Her eyes scanned the document, and I watched the muscles in her jaw go slack. Her skin went from a healthy tan to a ghostly, sickly gray. She stopped breathing. I could see the pulse jumping in her neck. She turned to the second page. Her hands started to shake. The paper rattled in her grip like a leaf in a storm. She turned to the third page, and a small, choked sound came out of her throat. It sounded like a wounded animal. What is it? Linda asked, reaching for the folder. Madison, what does it say? Madison didn't answer. She didn't even seem to hear her. She just stared at the papers. Then she let out a scream that was so loud and so sharp it made Tyler jump out of his seat. She slammed the folder shut and shoved it away from her like it was on fire. You old bastard, she shrieked. Her face was twisted with a kind of rage I had never seen before. It was the rage of someone who had been caught red-handed. You had no right. You had no right to look into my private affairs. This is illegal. I will sue you for everything you have." I sat there as steady as the stone foundation of the house. "You are talking about rights, Madison?" I asked quietly. "You are talking about what is legal. Let's talk about the $24,000 you moved out of the farm's maintenance fund over the last 6 months. Let's talk about the gambling debts in Atlantic City that are listed under my name because you stole my social security number. And while we are at it, let's talk about the fact that this house isn't even in my name anymore." Tyler gasped. Linda's mouth dropped open. Madison was panting, her chest heaving, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for an exit. "That is right," I said, looking at all of them. "I knew you were coming for me. I saw the signs months ago. So I did what any good engineer does. I reinforced the structure. I moved the house and the land into a non-profit foundation 2 weeks ago. I am the lifetime director, but I don't own the dirt anymore. The foundation does. And the foundation has very strict rules about who can live on the property." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than her screaming. "Rule number 1 is that no one who has committed financial fraud against the director is allowed on the premises. That means you, Madison, and anyone who supported you." Madison grabbed the gold pen and threw it at me. It hit my shoulder and fell to the floor. "I hate you," she screamed. "I wish you had died with Mom." "You are a pathetic old man." I didn't blink. I just looked at the clock. It was 4:30. The sun was going down and the shadows were getting long. "Well, Madison," I said, "you wanted a vote. You wanted a change. You got both, but I think it is time we see who really has the power in this family." I sat back and watched the chaos for a moment. Madison was pacing the length of the dining room, her expensive heels clicking like a hammer against the floorboards I had polished by hand. She was muttering to herself about lawyers and privacy laws, her face a mask of pure ugly fury. Linda was clutching her wine glass so hard I thought the stem might snap. And Tyler, my boy, he just looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. I felt a strange wave of sadness wash over me. It wasn't the anger I had felt earlier. It was a deep, quiet sorrow. As a mechanical engineer, I knew that when a machine fails, it is usually because one small part gave way and the rest followed. I looked at my children and wondered where the break had started. Was it my fault? Did I work too much? Did I give them too much stuff and not enough of myself? I wanted more than anything in that moment to be wrong. I wanted one of them to reach across the table, grab my hand, and tell me that the money didn't matter. I wanted them to choose me. I decided to give them one last chance, a final test. Not for the legal papers, but for their souls. I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but it cut through Madison's ranting like a knife. She stopped pacing and glared at me. What she spat. "What do you want now? Are you going to tell us you have more spy reports?" I didn't look at her. I looked at Tyler. "Tyler," I said softly. My voice was tired. It carried the weight of 72 years. "Tyler, look at me, son." He slowly raised his head. His eyes were red and watery. He looked like the little boy who used to cry when he fell off his bike. "Tyler," I said, "let's forget about the folder for a second. Let's forget about the bank accounts and the farm and the trust fund. I want to ask you a serious question, and I want you to be honest with me." Madison rolled her eyes and slumped into her chair, crossing her arms. "Here we go," she groaned. "The grand performance." I ignored her. "Tyler," I continued, "if everything I said was true, if I really did move this house into a foundation, if I lost every penny I had in the bank tomorrow, if I was standing on your doorstep in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and the clothes on my back, Would you open the door? The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. I leaned forward, searching my son's face for a glimmer of the boy I used to know. If I had nothing to give you, Tyler, no inheritance, no bailouts, no down payments, if I was just a broke old man who needed a place to sleep and a warm meal, would there be a room for me at your house? Would you take care of your old man because you love him? Tyler's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Madison. I saw her give him a sharp warning look. It was a look that said, "Don't you dare ruin this." Tyler looked back at me, then his gaze dropped back to the table. He started twisting his napkin into a tight rope. The silence went on for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Every tick of the clock felt like a heartbeat. I could hear the furnace humming in the basement. I could hear the distant sound of a car driving past on the snowy road. Tyler. I prompted, my heart sinking lower with every passing moment. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He just sat there frozen. The silence was his answer. It was a no. It was a cold, hard no. He couldn't imagine a life where I was a burden instead of a bank. He couldn't imagine giving back even a fraction of what I had given him. Madison let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, for God's sake, Dad," she said, throwing her hands up. "That is such a loaded, unfair question. You're trying to guilt-trip him. We live in the real world. Tyler has a 1-bedroom apartment and a high-stress job. He doesn't have the resources to run a private nursing home for you. That is exactly why we are trying to set you up in a professional facility. We are being responsible. You are being dramatic and manipulative." I looked at Madison. Her eyes were bright with a cruel kind of triumph. She actually thought she was winning the argument. She didn't see the tragedy of what she was saying. She didn't realize that she was admitting that her love had a price tag. I turned my head slowly to Linda. "And you, Linda," I asked. "You've lived in the house I paid for. You've eaten the food I bought. If I was the one who needed help, would you be there?" Linda took a long, shaky breath and looked at her wine glass. "Artie," she said, her voice thin and high. "You have to understand. I'm a widow. I have to look out for my own future. Madison promised me that if I supported the trust, I'd be taken care of for life. I can't risk that. You're being very difficult about this." I nodded slowly. I felt a strange sense of clarity. It was like the clouds had finally parted, and I could see the landscape for exactly what it was. It wasn't a pretty sight. It was a wasteland of greed and selfishness. But at least I knew the truth now. The test was over. They had failed. I didn't feel the urge to scream anymore. I didn't even feel the urge to cry. I felt a deep, profound pity for them. They were my children, and I had raised them to be successful and smart. But I had failed to raise them to be kind. They were rich in things, but they were paupers in spirit. They were willing to throw away a father who loved them for a piece of land and a few digits in a bank account. I reached out and picked up my water glass. My hand was steady. I took a sip and felt the cold water clear the tightness in my throat. "You know," I said, my voice sounding stronger now, "when your mother was sick at the very end, she grabbed my hand. She couldn't speak much, but she looked at me and whispered one thing. She said, 'Artie, take care of our babies.'" Madison's face softened for a split second, then hardened again. I looked at the three of them. "I spent 5 years trying to do just that," I said. "I thought taking care of you meant giving you everything you wanted. I thought it meant making your lives easy. But I see now that I was wrong. By making your lives easy, I made you weak. I made you cruel. And the most fatherly thing I can do for you right now, the only way I can truly take care of you, is to let you face the consequences of your own choices." Madison scoffed. "Consequences? What are you talking about? You're just an old man with a folder. You can't stop us. We have the law on our side. We have the vote." I mired her with a look of calm, steady wisdom. "Madison," I said, "you've spent so much time looking at the law, you forgot to look at the fine print. You think you are the only one who knows how to play this game. I spent 40 years in a machine shop. I know that if you put too much pressure on a weak joint, the whole thing explodes." I reached back into the yellow folder. I pulled out a small black device. It looked like a simple voice recorder. I placed it in the middle of the table right next to the turkey. "I've been sitting here for an hour," I said. "And this little machine has been listening to every word, every threat, every admission of fraud, every cold, heartless thing you've said to your father on Thanksgiving Day." Madison's eyes went wide. She reached for the recorder, but I was faster. I pulled it back and tucked it into my shirt pocket. "And that isn't the best part," I added. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 5 o'clock. "In about 2 minutes, I said, the guests I actually invited are going to arrive. And I don't think they are going to be interested in the stuffing." I looked at the empty chair at the far end of the table. That was Catherine's chair. Even though she had been gone for 5 years, I still set a place for her every Thanksgiving. I put out her favorite floral plate and the silver fork with the chipped handle. To my children, it was probably just a weird habit of an old man. But to me, it was a reminder of a promise. On the night she died, when the house was quiet and the hospital machines were humming, I held her hand. It felt like a bundle of dry twigs. She looked at the photos of Madison and Tyler on the bedside table and whispered, "Artie, keep the home fires burning. Don't let them lose their way." I had spent every day since then trying to keep that promise. I kept the house clean. I kept the gardens blooming. I kept my door open for every holiday. But as I looked at Madison's sneering face and Tyler's cowardice, I realized I couldn't save people who didn't want to be saved. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had betrayed the woman who gave them everything. They were standing in her dining room, eating the food she taught me how to cook, while they tried to dismantle her legacy. Madison laughed a harsh sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You're talking about Mom again?" she asked. "Dad?" Mom was a practical woman. She would have hated seeing you rot in this big house alone. She would have wanted us to have our inheritance while we're young enough to enjoy it. You're using her memory as a shield, and it's pathetic. I felt a coldness settle deep in my bones. It wasn't the cold of the Pennsylvania winter. It was the cold of a man who was finally done being patient. "You never knew your mother at all, did you, Madison?" I said. "She didn't care about inheritance. She cared about character. And right now hers is the only thing keeping me from losing my temper." I reached into the yellow folder one last time and pulled out my iPad. I tapped the screen and propped it up against the gravy boat. Madison and Linda leaned forward, frowning at the dark screen. Suddenly the screen flickered to life. It was split into 4 windows, showing different angles of the dining room we were sitting in. "What is this?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "Artie, are you recording us?" I ignored her. 2 more windows opened on the screen. 2 faces appeared in crystal clear, high definition. One was a man in a sharp gray suit sitting in a mahogany office. That was Marcus, my attorney, and one of my oldest friends. The other was a man with a weathered face and silver hair wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. That was Frank. We played high school football together 50 years ago. Madison's face went from gray to a sickly white. She stared at the screen like she was looking at a ghost. "Hello, Madison," Marcus said. His voice came through the iPad speakers loud and professional. "I hope you're enjoying the turkey. I certainly enjoyed watching you explain how you've been managing your father's assets. Frank nodded at the camera. Afternoon, Artie, he said. Sorry you had to go through this on a holiday, but we've got it all. Every word since the first toast. I looked at my daughter. You think I'm just an old man who can't figure out a remote control, don't you? I said. But I'm a mechanical engineer. I've spent my life designing systems that monitor performance and detect failures. When I started seeing the red flags in my bank statements, I didn't just sit and wait. I installed a high-end security system. These cameras aren't just for burglars, Madison. They are for anyone who tries to compromise the integrity of this home. Madison stood up so fast her chair flipped over and hit the floor with a loud bang. This is entrapment, she screamed at the iPad. You can't use this. I didn't consent to being recorded in a private home. Marcus leaned back in his chair on the screen. Actually, Madison, he said calmly, in the state of Pennsylvania, as long as one party consents to the recording in a private residence owned by that party, it is perfectly legal. And since your father owns the home, or rather the foundation he controls owns the home, every second of this footage is admissible. We have you on record admitting to moving funds. We have you on record threatening to have your father declared incompetent to steal his property. And we have you on record admitting to using his identity for your own debts. Tyler finally spoke up, his voice cracking. Dad, please. I didn't know about the money. I swear, I just thought we were helping you. I looked at him and, for the first time, I didn't feel any pity. You sat there and watched her treat me like a dog, Tyler. You nodded when she said I wasn't family anymore. Silence is a choice, son, and you chose the wrong side. I looked back at the screen. Marcus, I said. Is the paperwork ready? It's been filed and notarized, Artie, Marcus replied. The foundation has officially revoked all guest privileges for Madison Sterling, Tyler Sterling, and Linda Vance. They are legally considered trespassers as of 5 minutes ago. Madison started grabbing her purse, her hands shaking so hard she dropped her phone on the floor. You can't do this, she yelled. It's Thanksgiving. Where are we supposed to go? Frank. The deputy leaned toward his camera. Well, Madison, I'm currently sitting in my patrol car at the end of your father's driveway. I've got 2 of my officers with me. We're just waiting for Artie to give us the word. We can do this the easy way, where you walk out and get in your car. Or we can do this the hard way, where I come in there and escort you out in zip ties. It's your call. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The power had completely shifted. An hour ago, they were the ones standing over me acting like judges and executioners. Now they were trapped. They were the ones facing a cold night and an uncertain future. I looked at the 3 of them. I thought about all the years I spent worrying about their happiness. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent in that greasy shop so they could have everything they wanted. I realized that by trying to give them a perfect life, I had robbed them of the chance to become good people. I'm not going to arrest you today, I said. Not yet. Marcus is going to give you a list of the money you owe the foundation. If you pay it back, maybe we can keep the lawyers out of it. But as for this house and as for me, you got what you wanted. You voted me out of the family. Well, the feeling is now mutual. I stood up. My knees popped, but I felt taller than I had in years. I walked over to the front door and opened it. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine and wood smoke. The snow was falling heavily now, covering the world in a thick white blanket. I can see the blue lights of the police cars at the gate, I said. I suggest you leave now before Frank gets bored. Linda started to cry a high, annoying sound. Artie, please, she begged. I have nowhere to go. My house needs repairs. I don't have enough money for a hotel. I looked at her, the woman I had supported for a decade. Then I suggest you ask Madison for help, I said. She seems to be very good at managing other people's money. One by one, they shuffled toward the door. Madison didn't look at me. She kept her head down, her face red with shame and anger. Tyler tried to stop and say something, but I just pointed toward the driveway. He slumped his shoulders and walked out into the cold. As the last one stepped off the porch, I looked out into the darkness. I saw their taillights disappear down the long drive, followed by the slow, steady crawl of the patrol cars, making sure they didn't turn back. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock sounded like a final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I was alone. The house was quiet. The big turkey was still sitting on the table, mostly uneaten. But for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel lonely. I felt like the air was finally clear enough to breathe. The house was dead quiet for a split second after the police cars pulled away. I stood by the open door, feeling the freezing air bite at my skin. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice in Madison's eyes. She had reached the porch, but she turned back. She didn't look like my daughter anymore. Her face was twisted into something sharp and ugly. The mask of the successful, caring businesswoman had cracked and fallen off. What was left was a person I didn't recognize. "You think you won, don't you?" she screamed. Her voice was high and screeching, echoing off the wooden walls of the hallway. "You think you're so smart with your little cameras and your lawyer friend? But look at you, Dad. Look at this place. You're sitting in a museum of a life that ended 20 years ago. You're just a rotting old man in a rotting house, and you're holding us back." I didn't say a word. I just leaned against the doorframe, watching her. I wanted to see how deep the rot went in her soul. I wanted to know exactly who I had been supporting all these years. Madison took a step toward me, ignoring the snow that was already dusting her expensive coat. "You owe me," she yelled, pointing a finger at my chest. "Do you have any idea what my life is like? I have to move in circles with people who have real wealth, people whose fathers didn't spend their lives covered in grease and metal shavings. I had to work twice as hard to get where I am because you were too stubborn and too old-fashioned to do anything with this land. We could have sold this farm 10 years ago. We could have built luxury condos. We could have been worth $50 million by now." She was pacing the porch now, her arms waving wildly. But no, she continued mocking my voice. "Artie wants to keep the farm. Artie wants to protect the trees. Artie wants to honor Catherine's memory. Well, Mom is dead, Dad, and she's not coming back to thank you for keeping this drafty old barn. You wasted our potential. You kept us small because you were afraid of anything you couldn't fix with a wrench. You're a dinosaur, and I am sick of waiting for you to go extinct." I felt a sharp pang in my chest at the mention of my wife, but I kept my face like stone. Tyler was standing behind her, shivering. He looked terrified. He reached out to touch her arm, but she swung around and slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me, Tyler," she hissed. "You're just as pathetic as he is. You're a coward who can't even stand up for his own future. I did all the work. I did the research. I found the doctors who would sign the papers. I found the developers. And you just sat there like a little boy waiting for a permission slip." She turned back to me, her eyes red and wide. "I spent my whole life being the perfect daughter," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "I came to your boring dinners. I listened to your stupid stories about the shop. I pretended to care about your garden. I did my time, Dad. I earned that money. That trust fund isn't yours. It's mine. It's the payment for the 38 years I had to spend being related to a man who smells like motor oil and failure." Linda was crying on the stairs, clutching her purse. "Madison, please," she sobbed. "Let's just go. We can figure this out." "Shut up," Linda Madison barked without even looking at her. You're only here because you're a leech. You'd sell your own soul for a new roof, and we both know it. Don't act like you have a heart now. It was a strange thing to witness. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Madison was so consumed by her own ego that she was burning every bridge she had left. She didn't care about Tyler or Linda. She didn't care about me. She only cared about the fact that her hand had been pulled out of the cookie jar. She was an addict, and her drug was a lifestyle she couldn't afford on her own. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the expensive jewelry she was wearing, jewelry I had bought her for birthdays and graduations. I saw the designer shoes that were now getting ruined in the Pennsylvania slush. I saw a woman who had everything, and yet felt like she had nothing, because she didn't have it all. You're right about one thing, Madison, I said. My voice was quiet, but it seemed to fill the whole porch. I am old-fashioned. I'm from a time when people took pride in their work. I'm from a time when a man's word meant something. And I'm from a time when we looked after our family because it was the right thing to do, not because we expected a paycheck for it. I took a step forward, and she actually flinched. She thought I was going to hit her, but I just reached out and brushed a snowflake off her shoulder. I don't smell like failure, Madison, I said. I smell like 40 years of honest labor. I smell like the man who built a life that was good enough for you to want to steal it. You call me a dinosaur? That's fine. Because dinosaurs were strong. They were survivors. And they didn't need a Zoom meeting to know when they were being betrayed. I looked over her shoulder at Tyler and Linda. Get in the car, I said, before I changed my mind about the police. Madison stood there for a long time, her chest heaving, her mouth hanging open. She looked like she wanted to say something else, something even more hurtful, but she had run out of poison. She had emptied her soul onto my porch, and all it had done was make her look small and desperate. She turned around and stomped toward her Mercedes. She didn't help Linda. She didn't wait for Tyler. She got in the driver's seat and slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. A second later, the engine roared to life. She backed down the driveway like a maniac, throwing gravel and snow into the air. Tyler and Linda hurried into Tyler's car. He looked back at me one last time through the windshield. I could see the shame on his face. He knew he had lost the only person who truly had his back. He knew that from now on he was at the mercy of his sister, and she had just shown him exactly how much mercy she had. I watched their lights disappear into the white fog of the storm. I stood there until I couldn't hear the sound of their engines anymore. The only sound left was the soft hiss of the snow falling on the trees. I walked back inside and closed the door. I walked into the dining room. The table was a mess. Plates of half-eaten food, spilled wine, and that yellow folder sitting in the center like a judge's gavel. I looked at the chair where Madison had been sitting. I thought about the little girl who used to ask me to tuck her in every night. I wondered where that girl went, or if she had ever really existed at all. I realized then that Madison wasn't just evil. She was hollow. She had filled the hole in her heart with things and status. And when that was threatened, she turned into a monster. It was a tragedy, but it wasn't my tragedy anymore. I had done my job. I had provided. I had protected. And now I was going to do something I hadn't done in a very long time. I was going to take care of myself. I picked up my plate and went to the kitchen. I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel like a broken old man. I felt like a man who had finally cleared the weeds out of his garden. It was going to be a long winter, but for the first time in years, I knew the foundation was solid. The taillights of the Mercedes were fading into the white curtain of the storm, but suddenly they stopped. I stood behind the glass of the front door, my hand still resting on the deadbolt. I watched through the frost as the brake lights glowed like two angry red eyes in the dark. The driver's side door flew open and Madison stepped out. She didn't just walk back, she ran. She looked like a woman possessed, her coat flapping in the wind, her face twisted with a final desperate thought. She didn't knock. She hammered on the wood with her fists. "Open this door," she screamed. "Open it right now, you old thief. You can't keep those papers. That is my personal information. I didn't want to open it." I wanted to turn off the lights and go to bed. But as a mechanic, I knew that a pressure cooker doesn't stop whistling until you let the steam out. If I didn't face her now, she would be back with a brick through the window in the middle of the night. I turned the lock and pulled the door open just a few inches. "Go home, Madison," I said. "It is over." She didn't listen. She shoved her weight against the door, catching me off guard. She burst into the hallway, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. Her eyes weren't looking at me. They were locked on the dining room table, where the yellow folder was still sitting. She realized that as long as those bank statements and those recordings existed, her career was finished. Her reputation in the city would be trash. She thought if she could just grab that folder and burn it in the snow, she could pretend none of this ever happened. She lunged for the dining room. I moved faster than she expected. I might have a bad knee, but I spent 40 years reacting to snapping belts and falling heavy machinery. My reflexes were still there, buried under the gray hair and the wrinkles. I stepped in front of her, blocking the doorway. "Get out of my way," she shrieked. She reached out with her manicured nails, trying to claw at my face. But then she changed tactics. She dove low, trying to tackle her way past me to get to the table. We collided in the narrow hall. I felt her shoulder hit my chest, and for a second I stumbled back. She was younger, and she was fueled by a manic kind of energy. She scrambled past me, and her hand actually brushed the edge of the yellow folder. She let out a triumphant yelp. But she forgot one thing. She forgot that my hands were used to tightening bolts that required 200 pounds of torque. She forgot that I had spent my life lifting iron blocks and pulling heavy levers. I reached out and grabbed her wrist. My grip was like a vice. "Let go," she screamed, twisting and turning. "You're hurting me. I'll tell the police you attacked me." I didn't say a word. I just held on. I could feel the thin bones of her wrist under my fingers. I wasn't trying to hurt her, but I wasn't going to let her win. I pulled her hand away from the folder with one steady, irresistible motion. I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly on the floorboards I had installed myself. Madison was sobbing now, but it wasn't the sound of a daughter in pain. It was the sound of a spoiled child who had finally hit a wall she couldn't break. She started hitting my chest with her free hand, her blows landing weak and useless against my heavy flannel shirt. "Give it to me," she wailed. "It's my life. You're ruining my life." I looked her dead in the eyes. "No, Madison," I said. "You ruined your own life the moment you decided your father was an asset to be liquidated." With a sudden burst of strength, I used my shoulder to nudge her back toward the front door. She stumbled, her high heels slipping on the rug. She tried to regain her balance, but I didn't give her the chance. I didn't use violence. I just used the sheer, heavy mass of a man who had spent a lifetime doing real work. I pushed her back one step at a time toward the open door where the snow was drifting into the foyer. Tyler and Linda had gotten out of their car and were standing at the bottom of the porch steps, watching in horror. They saw their leader, the invincible Madison Sterling, being handled like an unruly apprentice. When we reached the threshold, I gave one final, firm shove. Madison tumbled back onto the porch. She landed hard on her rear end, her expensive coat soaking up the slush. She sat there, panting, her hair a mess, looking like a stranger I had picked up on the side of the road. I stood in the doorway, the light from the hallway casting a long, dark shadow over her. "Listen to me very carefully, Madison," I said. My voice was loud and clear, carrying across the yard to where Tyler and Linda were standing. "You came here today to tell me I wasn't family anymore. You came here to vote me out of my own home. Well, I hope you enjoyed the meal, because it is the last thing you will ever receive from me." I looked at Tyler and Linda. "That goes for all of you," I shouted. Madison tried to get up, her face red with shame. "You can't do this," she yelled. "We have rights." I didn't even flinch. "Madison, I said you aren't just removed from the will. You aren't just cut off. You are officially and legally evicted from this property. If any of you set foot past that gate again, I won't call Frank to escort you out. I will have you arrested for trespassing and felony fraud. Do you understand me?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But for the first time in my life, her hatred didn't hurt me. It felt like smoke. It had no substance. I stepped back and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the door. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said. I slammed the door shut. The sound was like a cannon blast in the quiet house. I turned the deadbolt, and then I turned the chain lock. I walked to the window and watched. Madison got up, brushed the snow off her pants, and walked to her car without looking back. Tyler and Linda followed her like ghosts. Their cars pulled away their headlights, cutting through the white abyss until they were gone. I walked back into the dining room. I picked up the yellow folder and held it to my chest. My heart was thumping hard and my hands were shaking just a little bit. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving me feeling tired and old. But under the tiredness, there was a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like the captain of my own ship again. I looked at the table. It was a disaster. Spilled gravy, dirty napkins, and the cold carcass of a turkey. It looked like a battlefield. I realized then that I couldn't stay in this room tonight. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a trash bag. I started clearing the plates one by one. I didn't care about the good china anymore. If something broke, it broke. I was cleaning up the mess they had made. Not just the physical mess, but the mess they had left in my life. It was going to take more than one night to fix it. But I was a mechanic. I knew how to take things apart and put them back together. I looked at the iPad on the table. The screen was dark now. Marcus and Frank were gone. I was alone in the house. The wind was still howling, and the trees were groaning under the weight of the snow, but as I stood there in the quiet of my kitchen, I felt a strange sense of relief. The war was over. I had defended my home. And now, I just wanted a cup of coffee. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The steam rose in the quiet air, and I took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I sat down at the small wooden table in the corner, the one where Catherine and I used to drink our coffee every morning for 40 years. I pulled the yellow folder out from under my arm and laid it flat on the scarred wood. To my children, this folder was a weapon. To me, it was just the result of a careful inspection. When you spend your life as an engineer, you learn that things don't just break overnight. There are always signs. There are always small cracks that appear long before the whole structure comes crashing down. I started noticing the cracks about 6 months ago. It started with the maintenance fund for the farm. I had set aside a good chunk of money in a dedicated account years ago, specifically to make sure the barn roof and the fencing would always be taken care of even after I was gone. I had given Madison access to that account because she was the one with the fancy business degree, and I thought I was being a good father by trusting her with the responsibility. But then I called the roofing contractor to come out and give me an estimate for the barn. He told me he couldn't do the work because the last check I'd sent for the shed repair had bounced. That felt like a punch to the gut. I knew I had $50,000 in that account. I went to the bank the next morning, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked the teller for a printout of the last 6 months of transactions. When she handed me those pages, I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. There were withdrawals every week. $2,000 here, $3,000 there. The locations of the withdrawals weren't for lumber yards or hardware stores. They were for casinos in Atlantic City and high-end boutiques in Manhattan. I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot for 2 hours just staring at those numbers. I wanted to believe there was a mistake. I wanted to believe someone had stolen her card. But then I saw the transfers to a credit card account I didn't recognize. I did some digging with a private investigator friend of mine, and what he found was even worse. Madison hadn't just been dipping into the farm fund. She had used my social security number to open 3 different high-interest credit cards in my name. She had run up nearly $80,000 in debt to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford on her own. She was drowning, and she had decided to use my life as her life jacket. That was the moment I realized the vote was coming. I knew she couldn't pay that money back. Her only way out was to get control of the farm, sell the land to developers, and use the millions from the sale to cover her tracks before I ever found out. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to bury her crimes under the foundation of my home. So I did what I had to do. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't want to give her time to hide the evidence or find a way to manipulate me. I went to see Marcus, my attorney. We spent 3 weeks working in secret. I realized that if I kept the farm in my own name, she would always find a way to peck at it like a vulture. Even if I changed my will, she could contest it in court for years after I was gone. I needed something permanent, something unbreakable. That is why I created the Sterling Heritage Foundation. It is a private charitable land trust. 2 weeks ago, I signed the deed over to the foundation. I am the director for as long as I live, but I no longer own the dirt. The foundation owns it. And the charter of that foundation is very specific. The land can never be sold for commercial development. It must remain a working farm or a nature preserve forever. By doing that, I didn't just protect myself. I protected the land from the greed of people like Madison. The most important part of the yellow folder wasn't just the bank statements, it was the legal lien of restitution. Because I had documented the embezzlement and the identity theft I had, Marcus filed a silent lien against Madison's own assets, her car, her apartment, and her future earnings. Every penny she stole from this farm is now a debt she owes to the foundation. She thought she was coming here today to take my home, but she ended up losing her own. I looked at the pages in the folder, the ink dark and final. I saw the photocopies of the checks she had forged with a shaky imitation of my signature. It broke my heart to see how little she valued the work I had done. To her, my 40 years in the shop were just a pile of money she was entitled to. She didn't see the sacrifice. She didn't see the love. She just saw an old man who was in the way. I reached for my phone and saw a text from Tyler. It just said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the money. Please call me." I looked at the message for a long time. Maybe he didn't know the details. Maybe he was just a follower, a weak man who let his sister lead him into darkness. But in my world, if you see a machine failing and you don't say anything, you are just as responsible for the crash as the person who broke it. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. As for Linda, I knew her game too. Madison had promised her a cut of the sale, a nice little condo in Florida where she wouldn't have to worry about Pennsylvania winters. She had traded her loyalty to her dead sister for the promise of a swimming pool. It was a cheap price for a soul. I closed the folder and tucked it back into the kitchen drawer. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of joy you feel at a wedding or a birth. It was the grim satisfaction of an engineer who has successfully repaired a dangerous fault. The system was stable again. The intruders were gone. The legacy was safe. I stood up and walked to the window. The snow was still coming down, turning the world into a silent white kingdom. I could see the silhouette of the barn through the drifts. Tomorrow I would call the roofer again. This time the check wouldn't bounce. This time the work would be done right. I was 72 years old, and I was alone on Thanksgiving. But as I watched the snow fall, I realized I had never been more at peace. I was no longer the victim of a vote. I was the master of my own house. And if that meant eating my turkey alone for the rest of my life, then that was a price I was more than willing to pay. I stood by the large bay window in the living room, my breath fogging up the glass. Outside, the world was a blur of white and blue. The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets now, covering the gravel of the driveway. But the flashing lights of the patrol cars cut through the storm like neon knives. I saw Frank, my old friend, and the deputy sheriff step out of his vehicle. He wasn't wearing his casual weekend flannel. He was in his full uniform, the brass star on his chest catching the strobe-like rhythm of the emergency lights. Two other officers stepped out behind him, their heavy boots crunching into the fresh powder. I watched as Madison tried to make a run for her Mercedes, but Frank was faster. He put up a hand, a gesture as solid and unmoving as a brick wall. Even from behind the glass, I could see the silhouette of my daughter waving her arms, her mouth moving in a silent, frantic scream. She was trying to play the victim. She was probably telling them that I was a senile old man who had lost his mind. She was probably telling them that she was the one in charge. But Frank didn't move. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the yellow envelope Marcus had sent over the official court-stamped orders from the Sterling Heritage Foundation. The realization hit her then. I could see it in the way her shoulders slumped for a second before she flared up again. She wasn't just losing a house. She was being treated like a common trespasser on the very land she thought she already owned. She looked back at the house, her eyes searching for the window where I was standing. For a brief second, our gazes locked. In that moment, I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I didn't feel the need to run out and save her from the cold. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction that tasted better than any Thanksgiving meal I had ever cooked. She had come here to put me out in the street. Now the street was exactly where she was standing. Frank gestured toward the gate. He wasn't giving them a week. He wasn't giving them until morning. He was giving them right now. I saw one of the younger officers walk over to Tyler's car. Tyler was sitting in the driver's seat with his head in his hands, the glow of the police lights reflecting off his windshield. The officer tapped on the glass with a heavy flashlight. Tyler jumped, his face pale and terrified. He looked like a little boy getting caught stealing from a candy jar. He rolled down the window, and I could see the officer speaking to him with a stern, no-nonsense expression. Tyler nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. Linda was standing near the porch steps, shivering violently. She didn't have her heavy coat on. She had left it in the hallway in her rush to get out. She was hugging herself, her thin shoulders shaking under her silk blouse. She looked at the house, then at Frank, then at the officers. She looked like a bird with a broken wing. But I knew better. I knew she was a bird of prey that had just lost its talons. One of the officers handed her a thermal blanket from the back of the cruiser. But he didn't invite her inside the warm car. He just pointed toward Tyler's vehicle. He was telling her it was time to leave. Madison wasn't going quietly, though. She tried to push past Frank, her heels slipping in the slush. She was reaching for the porch, her face red with a manic, desperate energy. She thought if she could just get back inside, she could find a way to win. but Frank caught her by the arm. It wasn't a violent move, but it was firm. He spun her around and pointed toward the end of the driveway. He was done talking. The time for family arguments was over. This was a legal execution of a trespass order. I saw her go limp for a second, the fight finally draining out of her. She looked at her beautiful, expensive Mercedes, which was now half covered in snow. She looked at the dark, looming silhouette of the barn. And then she looked at the heavy oak door of the house, the door I had locked and bolted. She realized that the vote she was so proud of had actually been her own eviction notice. She had walked into this house as the queen of the family, and she was leaving it as a stranger with a criminal record hanging over her head. The satisfaction I felt was deep and quiet. It was the feeling of a machine finally running smooth after a long, grinding breakdown. For years I had let them walk all over me. I had let them treat my kindness like a weakness. I had let them think that because I was old, I was obsolete. But as I watched them scramble into their cars in the freezing dark, I realized that I had finally taught them the most important lesson of all. Respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. And loyalty isn't a strategy. It's a choice. Tyler's car started first. His exhaust pipe sent a plume of white smoke into the air. He backed out slowly, his tires spinning and whining on the icy gravel. Linda was in the passenger seat, her face pressed against the window, looking at the house like she was seeing a ghost. They moved toward the gate, followed closely by one of the patrol cars. They weren't just leaving. They were being escorted out of my life. Then came Madison. She got into her Mercedes and slammed the door. I could hear the roar of the engine even from inside the house. She didn't drive away slowly. She floored it. Her car fishtailed wildly, throwing a spray of slush and mud against the white picket fence I had painted last spring. She nearly hit the gate post as she roared out onto the main road. She didn't look back. She didn't wave. She just fled into the darkness, a disgraced queen without a kingdom. Frank stayed for a minute. He walked up to the porch and tapped on the door. I opened it just a crack. "You okay, Artie?" he asked. His breath came out in a long white cloud. I nodded. "I'm better than okay, Frank. Thanks for coming out on a night like this." "No problem," he said, adjusting his hat. "They're gone. I'll have a car sit at the end of the drive for a few hours, just to make sure they don't get any bright ideas about coming back." "You get some sleep, old friend. You've had a long day." I thanked him and closed the door. I walked back into the dining room. The silence was different now. It wasn't a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the quiet of a house that had been cleaned. I looked at the table. I saw the gold pen Madison had tried to force me to use. I picked it up, walked to the kitchen, and dropped it into the trash can. It made a small, pathetic clink against a turkey bone. They had come for a feast, and they had come for a fortune. They left with empty stomachs and empty pockets. They had tried to use the law to steal my life, and the law had been the very thing that threw them out into the cold. As I stood in my quiet kitchen listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the whistle of the wind, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was 72 years old, and I was alone on Thanksgiving. But for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly who I was. I was Arthur Sterling, and this was my home. The house was finally quiet. The heavy front door was locked, and the shouting had faded into the howling wind. I walked back into the dining room and looked at the table. It was a mess of spilled wine and half-eaten food, but the tension that had been choking the air for years was gone. I picked up a clean plate and carved a small piece of the turkey. I took a scoop of the stuffing and a bit of the cranberry sauce. Then I walked over to my old leather armchair by the fireplace. I used a long match to start the fire. The dry oak logs caught quickly crackling and popping as the orange flames began to dance. I sat down and let the warmth wash over me. I took my first real bite of dinner. It was delicious. For the first time in 5 years since Catherine passed away, I didn't feel like I was waiting for a storm to hit. The storm had already come. It had tried to knock my house down, and I was still standing. As I sat there in the glow of the fire, I realized something important. I had spent so many years being afraid of being alone. I thought that as long as my children were in this house, I had a family. But I was wrong. A family isn't just people who share your last name or your DNA. A family is made of people who respect you, who protect you, and who love you for who you are not, for what you can give them. I thought about Frank, the deputy, who stood out in the freezing snow to make sure I was safe. I thought about Marcus, my lawyer who spent his holiday monitoring my security cameras because he cared about my justice. These men were technically strangers, but today they were more of a family to me than my own flesh and blood. They didn't want my land. They didn't want my bank account. They just wanted an old man to be able to eat his Thanksgiving dinner in peace. Freedom has a price. For me, that price was the dream of a happy, united family. It hurt to realize that the children I raised had turned into people I didn't even recognize. It felt like a death in the family. But as the fire warmed my tired bones, the sadness started to lift. I wasn't losing my family. I was losing a burden. I was losing the constant worry and the secret fear that I was being used. I looked up at Catherine's picture on the mantel. I felt like she was smiling at me. I had kept the home fires burning just like I promised. I had saved our legacy from being paved over for a quick buck. The farm was safe. The trees would keep growing, and I would keep living. I want to speak to you now, the person watching this. Maybe you are sitting in a quiet house too. Maybe you feel like you have to keep giving and giving until there is nothing left of you, just to keep your children or your relatives happy. Maybe you are afraid that if you say no, you will be alone. Let me tell you something I learned tonight at 72 years old. It is never too late to start over. It is never too late to stand up and say my life has value. Your dignity is worth more than any inheritance. Your peace of mind is worth more than a fake smile at a dinner table. Do not let people treat you like a rug just because your hair is gray or your hands are shaky. God gave us our lives to live, not just to be a resource for others. If the people you love treat you like an enemy, it is okay to show them the door. It is okay to choose yourself. You might be surprised to find that when you let go of the people who hurt you, you finally have room to hold on to the people who truly care. The sun will come up tomorrow, and the snow will be white and beautiful. I will wake up, make a fresh pot of coffee, and I will look out at my fields. I don't know if I will ever speak to Madison or Tyler again. That is up to them and their own consciences. But I do know this: I am not a victim. I am a man who fought for his home and won. Thank you for listening to an old mechanic's story. If you are going through something like this, stay strong. Trust your gut. And remember, the light doesn't go out just because you're getting older. Sometimes it just gets a little bit clearer. I am going to finish my dinner now, in the quiet, in the warmth, and in the peace. What do you think of my decision? Would you have done the same for your children? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts with me. I read every one of them, and it makes my house feel a little fuller. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these stories together. Good night, and God bless.